You're listening to Release Your Resistance with Bex Beltran, episode 100. Welcome to Release Your Resistance. This is Bex. The only reason why any of us don't have what we want in life is because of our own resistance. Right now, I'm learning how to recognize and release my resistance, and this podcast tells you how you can release your resistance so that you can live the exact life that you want. Let's get started. Can you believe it is the 100th episode? Isn't it exciting? I just had to try to do that fun little sound effect just for celebration purposes, and I want to celebrate and commemorate and reflect with you today. So I am sharing some of the biggest transformations, benefits, and surprises that have come over the past 2 years. Plus, I'll let you know what is next for season 3 of the Release Your Resistance podcast. Before I even started the podcast, I am so glad that I gave myself a runway. By runway, I mean I knew at least 6 months before I started that I was planning to launch the podcast on the first Friday of January 2020. And I spent those 6 months thinking about the podcast and the launch, writing content, mapping out the editorial calendar, and then learning how to podcast. I spent that time figuring out the technology. And I was thinking about my website and about how I wanted to launch. I planned a launch party. I did all of this in the months leading up to bringing this podcast into existence. Because I did give myself so much time to think of all those little details and to plan, none of it felt too difficult or too overwhelming. None of it felt like it was beyond my ability. I knew, and I continued to tell myself, that I had plenty of time to figure out how to start a podcast. Speaking of the launch, I love that I announced the podcast so publicly. That public announcement to such a variety of people gave me a feeling of accountability and a feeling of determination. I would probably not have felt so determined if I had kept it quiet and just decided to spring this podcast on everybody one Friday morning. But I am so grateful to myself that I did launch publicly because it was a lot more fun. It gave me something to talk about with people. It gave me something to look forward to, which was the launch lunch that I had the day after the launch. And that was just fun in itself, to be able to plan a party. With hindsight now, I see that turned out to be one of my only big parties in 2020. Luckily, we got it in before everything shut down. It was fun to think of who I would invite and how I would publicize it and how I could celebrate this new podcast. And I got tremendous support and cooperation from other people. I had sponsors who paid for the lunch. We had a beautiful setting. A friend came in from out of state and helped with the finishing details. Friends and family members and coworkers showed up to help me launch. Everyone that I could think of was just so supportive and so celebratory with me. And planning that party made starting this podcast feel fun and made it something to look forward to. Those were some of the reflections about leading up to starting the podcast. The next reflection to tell you about is how my style changed. When I think about the actual podcast creation and the actual episodes as they came out every week over the last 2 years, I have to say, I am surprised at how my creation style has changed. When I was in that pre-launch period, I had an expectation or standard for myself. I decided I would write out each episode's script. Each one would be well-researched, well thought and well-written. Then each episode would be recorded in a very thoughtful and enjoyable way for the listener. I really wanted to be super prepared. I worked in advance. I had an expectation of myself that my episodes would be quote unquote in the can at least a month before going live. And it's been really interesting to see how that expectation has completely dissipated and evaporated over the past 2 years. For the first couple of months of the podcast, I kept up that pace. I kept up the expectation. But as things progressed, I found myself not always having an episode ready to go a month in advance, and sometimes not even a week in advance. Watching my own brain through that evolution has been really interesting because at the beginning, when I noticed I didn't have an episode ready to go as far in advance as I thought I needed to, it made me judge myself. I called myself names like unprepared and lazy and disorganized and sloppy. Those are just not great things to refer to oneself as. I had a lot of judgment about myself for not keeping up that prepared pace. Spoiler alert, that judgment has since been dropped. I have decided I was completely wrong about those expectations that I had at the beginning. On the other hand, sometimes I would get episode ideas and they would just roll through me and flow out of me and be so inspired. And those flowy episodes were authentic for me and fun for me to think about and record and publish. It was interesting to notice those flowy episodes didn't need all the prepared time. They didn't need all the edits and the thoughtful consideration of weeks of writing and editing and considering. They could basically be written in a morning and recorded either the same morning or that afternoon, and they were really good episodes. Off the top of my head, a few examples of those episodes that just flowed right out of me were how to interpret your own dreams and how to make a vision board. Those two just came right out, no problem at all. And more recently, another concept that just appeared to me and then became its own episode was motion and the model. And the idea for that one came as I was taking a walk, and then I was also able to use that concept as an impromptu presentation for a group that I attended later that day, and then I also used it as a podcast episode. I just really loved how easy and effortless and flowy those episodes were created. I didn't have to follow my own quote-unquote rule that you must have this episode outlined and you must have these talking points figured out and it has to be carefully edited. Those are just rules that I had about my episodes that might have been helpful, and some listeners may appreciate the work that I did, but also it might not have been important in any way whatsoever. Partway through working on the podcast in 2020, my first year of podcasting, I watched some instructional videos about content creation. I learned how other podcasters come up with their topics and their content. I probably had heard this before, but somehow the idea of batch work stuck out to me that time in 2020. And batching content is using, for example, one day a month to do all of one type of task, maybe writing, and then a different day to do all of another type of task, maybe editing or recording. And then maybe a third day of the month to put them all in the queue for publishing and get all the social media images lined up, and just doing the same type of task in one big batch, like an assembly line. Instead of what I do, which is doing each of those tasks for each of the episodes individually and separately. The organized part of my brain and the efficient part of my brain like this idea, but I haven't really implemented that strategy for myself yet, not because I'm resistant to it, but because I guess I'm just not that interested in it yet. I guess I just like how things have been going. But as I look forward to season 3, which will start in 2022, after I take a short break, I am curious about how I can experiment with batching. How would I like it? Would it work for me? It's going to be interesting to watch the continuation of the evolution of the Release Your Resistance podcast to see how things change. Let's talk about some surprises that have come as a result of 100 episodes. One of the surprises was that the back-end administration got so easy and routine for me. Here's how and why it has been a surprise. Back when I first started publishing my podcast weekly, I would write the podcast as I described. I took it slow. I gave myself a lot of lead time to write and then edit and then re-edit and then really come up with the perfect episode, which now, as I look back at some of those, sometimes I think I could have done so much better. Those episodes weren't that perfect, but okay, at the time, it is exactly what I wanted. And then the week of, or maybe the week before, I would go into the back end in my systems, in my podcast host, and in my website, and I would set up the episode administratively so that it would post at the time that I wanted it to post, and so that there would be an accompanying email to go out to my email list of my favorite people, and I would have a corresponding social media post. And back in early 2020, all of these administrative tasks felt so cumbersome. They felt like a lot of little steps and a lot of little things to keep track of. And I remember worrying that I could forget something. And I told myself I should probably have a checklist of all of those little steps that I do as part of this process so that I don't forget anything. And I remember sitting down when it was time to do that task and really feeling like it was this big chore to get through. And now, here's the surprise, I think, oh, it's second nature. It probably only takes me less than 20 minutes. It's pretty simple. It's pretty effortless. It's just not that big of a deal. That switch in my attitude has been such a surprise to me. It shouldn't be a surprise, but the reason I'm sharing it with you is as a reminder that something that we can find very complicated and complex and time-consuming and maybe even annoying when we are new at it might turn out to be something that is very easy and second nature and not that big of a deal at all. Now, on the other side of that continuum, something that used to be relatively simple for me, which has become a lot more complicated and complex and seems to have a lot more resistance pulsing from it, is content creation. In late 2019, I had my editorial calendar. I knew the topics that I wanted to talk about. I felt like there was just so much I wanted to share. I had countless ideas. I could see the through line, the string from one topic to the next. It all just made perfect sense. And I loved the whole idea of coming up with all these various episodes, and it all fit around the topic of resistance and managing our minds. And I was ready to share my own personal journey and how my life has transformed. I was excited to talk about how coaching is such a transformational experience. I had all this content and all these ideas just flowing out of me at the end of 2019. And then, of course, throughout 2020, in 2021, here in season 2, the biggest surprise is how resistant I have been to coming up with new episode topics. It has been so hard for me. I have struggled with it almost weekly. It has caused me to question everything about myself and the podcast and my coaching practice. Not to question myself in a bad way. Don't take this as doubt or being down on myself. Certainly not. But my resistance to episode topics caused me to question in a curious way. I asked myself, is this how I want to spend my time? Does this still feel good to me? Is this what I want to be doing as I live my life? Is this aligned with who I am now? I've just had all these questions. And let me interrupt myself just in case I am putting anyone on edge right now. I have had a few people who have questioned me about this in individual conversations, and I don't want anyone to worry. The podcast is continuing. I don't want to end it after 2 years and after 100 episodes. I love this podcast. I love having this identity of being a podcaster. There is a lot more that can be said and shared and experienced in this communication that you and I have every Friday. But I also believe in evolution. I also know that seasons change, and literally podcast seasons change. So here we are at the end of season 2. I have 2 more episodes planned for you this month. And then I'll take a break for the rest of 2021. And starting in 2022, I am not sure exactly which date, I will start season 3. I haven't planned how long this mid-season break between 2 and 3 will be, but I know I will start season 3 in 2022, and I know it will be different. I am dropping all of the expectations that I've had for myself throughout seasons 1 and 2. Those expectations that I had and maintained and kept that are no longer rules that I will hold myself to. I won't be posting an episode every Friday. At least I don't have that expectation of myself. If I do, that's great. I'll do it. But I don't have the expectation of myself that I must post an episode every Friday in season 3. I'm following the example of one of my favorite teachers and podcasters, Jess Lively, who posts a new episode whenever she feels like it. I'm going to be experimenting with different formats, as you've already seen me do in the past few months. You've seen me interview more guests. You've seen me have a recorded book club. You've seen me share more personal things not related to resistance, like my reading recommendations and updates about my renovation, which, by the way, if you've heard any noise during today's podcast, is because we're getting a new roof. So the renovation is continuing, but we're almost done. But yeah, I've shared a lot of different things, including my favorite gifts to give and receive. And I even gave an episode about how to start a pod club. None of those topics are necessarily related to resistance, although you might find a connection. I want to continue my exploration and experimentation of having different formats, different topics, and different guests. And we'll just see what happens. I'm going to be open to experimentation more than I ever have been before when we get to season 3. One thing I am going to be experimenting with in the coming months is being a guest on other podcasts as well. So I'm looking for opportunities where I can share my favorite topics and talk with other podcast hosts to their audience about resistance and about journaling, about coaching, and about all the things that I love to talk about. Maybe I'll throw in some business brainstorming and tech coaching. I'm looking for opportunities. So if you listen to other podcasts and you think I would be a great fit, why don't you make an introduction? You could introduce me to the host of another podcast that you are a super fan of, and maybe we could do a pod swap. That podcast host could be on my show and have me on their show. There's a lot of different things we could do. It is so interesting to experiment with because I'm dropping all of my previous expectations that I used to have. I still want to keep this podcast focused on something that I find valuable to share with you. I don't want to create an episode just to have an episode. I want to make sure that it's something that I think you will benefit from hearing or something that gives you a different perspective. I want to share something that's worked for me or something that's worked for someone else with you so that you can consider it for yourself. And as I was thinking about the last 2 years and about the last 100 episodes, I wondered what have been the biggest benefits. There have been so many benefits. I have met new clients. I have met colleagues. I have been able to tease out my own thoughts and ideas about concepts that I want to intentionally use in my life. And my number one benefit is also somewhat of a surprise. I would say the number one benefit for me personally, maybe not necessarily for you, has been the connection that this podcast has strengthened between me and my parents. I have heard other podcasters joke and say things like, oh, when I first started, the only person who listened was my mom. And they say that as if that's something that is not what they want. When I started the podcast, I had a goal to have at least one listener per episode, and I had already decided that listener would be me, so I was already guaranteed to be successful. And then when my parents started listening each week, that tripled my success rate. When I look at what has unfolded for me over the last 2 years, and I see that my mother and father have been my number one fans and most consistent listeners and most encouraging commenters, I am just so grateful that my parents listen to this podcast weekly. Frequently, after a podcast episode airs, I'll get a phone call and we will have a follow-up discussion about the episode. I love that my parents find value in what I'm sharing. Sometimes I think of this podcast as like a three-way conversation between me, my mom, and my dad. And it would be 100% worth it if that was the case. And at the same time, I am so delighted that you and other people are able to listen and learn and share and consider even while I am having this conversation with my mom and dad. The connection with my parents has been the number one benefit, which was completely unexpected and completely unplanned for. And this fun new connection with them is just a very, very happy byproduct of creating the podcast. The number two benefit from having this podcast for the last 2 years and 100 episodes has been that it has kept me open and curious. When I realized that the topics were not flowing out of me 20, 30, 40 episodes in the way that they had been before, I did have to get a little more open. I did want to start paying attention to what topics I just take for granted, which would be very helpful or interesting for other people to hear a new perspective about. So I got curious about which topics deserved repeating, because we all need to hear things more than once. We can never hear the same episode twice. I love that this work of creating this collection of thoughts and ideas has really stretched me to stay open and curious and exploratory and experimental. Another thing that has been both a surprise and a benefit is what I talked about earlier when it came to loosening my own expectations. I surprised myself by being willing to be in the discomfort of a Tuesday or even Wednesday afternoon, knowing that I had an episode to post for Friday morning and not being 100% sure what I was going to post. When I say discomfort, that is high discomfort for me, because I am a planner. I am a preparer. I like things ready to go. I like things planned out in advance. When I found myself those weeks, many more in the recent months than in the first 18 months, I really got to get curious and trust myself. It was interesting to watch that transformation from my brain telling me, oh no, this is the worst thing ever. Here it is Monday morning and you're not sure what you're posting on Friday, to my brain relaxing so much and being so confident and so trusting on a Wednesday, saying, yeah, it's true. I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to post on Friday, but I know I am going to come up with something, and I know there's something good that I can post that I like and that other people will like. That has been a really fun shift for me to drop that expectation that I had from the past. Another benefit of having this podcast for the past 2 years is that it has been such a lovely conversation starter. I am a pretty consistent networker. You heard that from my episode with The Kindest Karen. I try to network at least once and sometimes more than once a week, and I love to meet new people. I love being able to introduce myself as a coach, a podcast host, and a journal creator. And frequently, someone who I meet will have their curiosity and interest piqued by one of those 3 titles. So frequently they want to hear about the podcast. So many of us love listening to podcasts. So many of us learn so much by audio. We all have different things that we do throughout the day where we can listen while we do something else. And whenever I meet someone and mention that I have a podcast, if they tell me that they love podcasts, we get to talk about which podcast we listen to and why, and we trade information on where and how we listen. It's just been a lovely way to make a connection with someone who I've just met. The other fun thing for me in telling people that I'm a podcast host is getting to hear that they have been curious about podcasts, but they don't know anything about them and they don't even know how to listen. So then I get to share and tutor people right on the spot on their phones or on their devices about how they can download a podcast and listen immediately or on their way home. Just knowing how much listening to podcasts has changed my life makes me so happy that I am able to share, even if it's not my podcast, with other people so that they now have this life-changing resource in their life too. Those are some of my reflections, surprises, and benefits about creating 100 episodes for you. What are your reflections and surprises? What benefits do you get from listening to this podcast and others? Please share with me. I would love to hear from you. You can email me at hi@bexby.org. And you can also leave a comment in the show notes for this 100th episode at bexby.org/100, spelled out HUNDRED. And in case you are curious about what else I will be doing in the beginning of 2022 without all the rules and expectations that I've had for the past 2 years about my episode posting schedule, I have made a goal for myself to fill my coaching schedule. That's been a goal, obviously, since I started my coaching practice, but I have noticed that the structure and rules that I applied to this podcast can also be applied to the way that I market myself. So that is what I will be prioritizing. And one way is that I'm specifically thinking about other business owners, maybe in the same situation that I was in 2 years ago, or maybe who just have a different perspective than I do, who consider themselves, quote unquote, not techie, or dare I say, maybe they even say tech resistant. I know coaching helps us release resistance in all areas of our lives, including relationships, our thoughts about work, money, our ability to love and forgive ourselves, and so many other areas. So one specific type of coaching that I want to offer specifically to technology resistant people is tech coaching and tutoring. So do you know someone who could use help in that area? Like someone who's trying to grow their business but isn't showing up regularly on social media maybe because they don't like social media and they don't get it and they wish they didn't have to. That is tech resistance, and I can help. In fact, every Wednesday in December, I am doing a tech resistance workshop covering a different topic at the very beginning level for people who may have tech resistance in their business. So go to bexby.org/tech resistance, all spelled out, all squished together, to get the details. And thank you so much for listening today and for listening to 100 episodes, or however many you have listened to so far. I hope you are celebrating with me. This has been so fun, so rewarding, so educational, and I cannot wait to see what comes next. And next week, I have another interview planned with a very fun and interesting guest. You will love meeting Michelle Brown, so make sure that you are subscribed and that you are on my email list. Just go to bexby.org/favorites to join so that you get notified when that episode and all the rest come out. Thank you again. Michelle and I will talk with you next week. This has been Release Your Resistance. Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, make sure you're subscribed and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, think about someone who you know who would love this episode and share it with them. There should be a share button on your app if you're listening to this on your phone. If you'd like to continue this conversation one-on-one or in real time, come visit me on my site at bexby.org to see how we can work together.